Good afternoon and welcome to Perspectives on Sustainable Development. I'm your host, Chris Whitehead. I'm excited about this episode today. Anyone who's been paying attention to the podcast or my posts and writings and stuff on LinkedIn and other outlets, I've been a big fan of large-scale renewable projects and the promise they hold on various levels. First, from an air quality perspective, but then also what they can offer for local communities. Because that's where all of our work starts from, right? I start every presentation I give publicly with a slide of my children. Not to not to brag because I have adorable kids and I do, by the way. But just to say that I'm so passionate about the work I do because I do think of my kids, trying to give them a better future. And a lot of the large scale development that's been coming through over the last couple of years has involved environmental justice, climate impact work, but also public engagement work and economic development and community workforce development stuff that a lot of people aren't quite accustomed to or don't have the expertise in. A few years ago, when I was doing a project for offshore wind in New York, I decided to look at the intersection of environmental justice and offshore wind and what that exactly looked like and steps we could take to be sure these communities, what projects are going to be happening, are going to be getting the benefits that they potentially can out of these large changes. At the time, I was lucky enough to meet, or I should say, probably be referred to Rebecca Karp from Karp Strategies. I think we first met at an IPF conference maybe 3, 4 years ago or something like that. And we just kind of instantly bonded over, I think, a shared passion to do this type of work. So when I started planning this episode and talk about these topics, only only one name came to mind. So I'm excited to have her on today. I'm going to bring her on as well. But then also fortunate to have Ali-Sutherland Brown on, who I haven't known as long as Rebecca, but I've been extremely impressed with her knowledge on these topics as well. And frankly, I never thought I would be bringing on two people from the same company, but I just want that to be a commentary on what I think of Karp Strategies and the fact that I come from a small business background myself. I started out at WBE forever ago, it feels like. So I kind of appreciate a couple of the challenges that they face as they try to build up a brand and develop work and do things the right way. So I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. And I guess without further ado there, welcome Ali and Rebecca.
So Rebecca Karp, CEO, founding principal of Karp Strategies. My background um, is pretty varied, and I know that we have a number of like college students and grad students, who tune in. So just I'll briefly say, like, I never thought I would start and run and grow what is now like a multi-million-dollar company with many employees. Um, if you would have told me that in my early 40s that I would have two college degrees, that I would have worked at one of the largest bi-state infrastructure and economic development agencies in the world, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, that has a budget bigger than most countries, I would have been like, what? If you would have told me I would have worked at a global engineering firm, I also would have questioned your judgment and understanding of who I am. If you would have told me I would have worked at a community economic development organization and CDFI in rural Maine, Coastal Enterprises Inc., CEI, I'm looking at you, where I had the opportunity to help immigrant female farmers establish their businesses. I also would have been like, what? And that I would have worked at multiple economic development organizations and agencies in New York City, and then started my own company, which now is going to be celebrating 10 years next year. I might have just told you you were a little bit out of your mind, but here I am. So have worked cross-sector, nonprofit, government and multiple agencies, a global corporation, have done an undergrad degree and graduate degree work, have worked at a nonprofit that's also done a lot of work in consensus building around large scale, infrastructure projects, and have really spent, I think, the really spent my career thinking about how do we build stronger communities? How do we build places in which people are proud to live and work? How do we build projects? I think that, not to be naive or sentimental, but like that make the world a better place. And how do we have projects that give some certainty in the development market, but where communities can actually have agency in the places in which they live? And that's been the throughput of my work. I was born and raised in the Hudson Valley of New York State, spent my summers in rural Minnesota, spent a good part of my high school years living in Tokyo, college in Maine and Cambridge, and now I've been in New York City for just under 20 years. And so I like bring a lot of that experience and life of different places with me, and bring that to my practice. So happy to dig into all of that throughout the conversation or to follow up with any students on the call who are thinking about their own career choices. And we'll talk more about Karp Strategies in a minute, but Ali is much more interesting than me. So Ali, I'm going to kick it to you.
No, Rebecca, I love that you say that about, I'll give an introduction, but I want to pick back up on that theme of not knowing where things are going to take you. So by way of introduction, Ali-Sutherland Brown, I'm a principal at Karp Strategies. I was the first employee after Rebecca founded the firm. And for many of those early years, it was she and I and, a graduate student intern. I am trained as an urban planner, with originally a specific focus sort of on community health, a general sense of well-being, and the way in which the built environment can promote a sense of especially psychological, well-being and mental health. So I approached urban planning very much from like a physical perspective of how can you make great places. And part of what has kept me at Karp Strategies is actually a sort of a shift in that mindset. Not that all of that doesn't matter, but that you first need the foundation of an incredible, a great economy, people who want to contribute to their communities, kind of like the community and economic development aspect is really what has changed for me and is sort of an unexpected turn that I think my career has taken. With that, I joined Karp Strategies initially because I recommend to those of you listening who are, in grad school or undergrad, like I recommend consulting for anybody. It's really challenging and it's also like brain candy because you get to think about and help solve, myriad problems. So that's why I joined, but why I've stayed, and this is the unexpected part, is I thought becoming an urban planner, I would, derive a lot of passion and sort of career satisfaction out of building places. And I certainly do, and that's certainly the work that we do. But I think what's been unexpected for me is my interest in growing and making an organization, like building an organization as opposed to a place, and the importance of having great internal infrastructure in order to do that work that impacts people's lives, in the way that you guys are both talking about.
I think that's great. And frankly, I didn't know you were the first employee, and being there as long as you have, I think really the term partner is absolutely accurate. But I have to wonder too, for as much as you and Rebecca work on obviously the same types of projects, have comparable backgrounds, skill sets, all of that, do you feel cap not capable, that's the wrong word, but do you feel open if you don't agree with something or have another point of view to having that point of view heard?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Um, we were talking about this before, and I think it's not just about the two of us. We disagree or don't have the same point of view on things all the time. I think that's also true for the people who work here. We try to, and hopefully, in many cases, our clients as well and the partners that we work with.
I'll piggyback what you were saying because
Yeah.
it's like, Chris, I love this question so much because I think it's at the heart of building teams and organizations. I think it's a bit at the heart of us also being a team not that's just led by women, but like our leadership team is exceptionally diverse by like many metrics, and that's by design. And it's also, I think, important, and thinking about disagreement and how you work through it and how you communicate, it's critical when we're thinking about sustainability and sustainable development, community economic development, environmental justice, infrastructure, like the work that you do, the work that we do, the work that others who participate on your podcast work in. These are some of the most complex, meaty challenges of the day, right? I mean, if I take a huge step back, if Ali and I take a huge step back, right? And we think about the mission of our organization, like we show up every day thinking about how do we build stronger, thriving, resilient communities in which people are proud to live and work and in which they can access the means to do so. And it's interesting, Ali, to hear you reflect and say, you shifted it more from physical work to like community economic development. I feel like you've really shifted me from being like, oh, like the people and the economics to now I'm also much more like, oh, place is such an important part of that, and really thinking more holistically. So, Chris, like when we disagree, and we disagree all the time, like it can be about anything. It's where do we start in a particular methodology? It's what work do we go after as a small and growing firm? Like I am 100% a founder's founder at my core. I am like the child of an entrepreneur, like someone who started multiple organizations. When my other parent retired, they then went on to, support multiple organizations. My brother is an entrepreneur and a founder of several organizations. So it's just like in my DNA. And like I could literally be on my deathbed and I'm still like, oh, what should we do? Or there's this problem, or there's this new regulation that creates this new opportunity. Or I love that you thought of us to be on this podcast, but also there are like 50 people who then are not on the podcast. And what does that mean? And how do we consider their perspective? Like all I could do is come up with ideas, and I have literally 20 other business plans going at any given time. And sometimes Ali is like, should we do all of those things at once? And I'm like, yes. And she'll be like, like, I don't know, go for it, Ali. I feel like you were going to chime in.
No, totally. No, I just like, I really agree with that. And I think like to reframe the idea of disagreeing a little, I think disagreement is incredibly important and productive.
Agreed.
Especially where you are continually trying to improve and get better and fix what doesn't work. And I mean that in terms of like organizationally, but also like thinking about these big problems in regards to sustainability and city moving projects. But I also think in that context that it's really important to have the same goal that you're driving towards, right? So I think that it's incredibly productive and fruitful within the ability to be moving, right, when you're also agreed that you're moving in the same direction and that we're trying to achieve the same kind of impact. And I think that's what's really important about it.
Hypothetically, if a developer wanted to support a local community that they're coming into, pump $100,000, $200,000 into a project, is there a method for looking into what the best bang for the buck on those dollars might actually be?
So to me, it's having a lot of humility to, I think what we do really well is identify, hyper local experts somewhere and connect them to resources, and then give clients an overall sort of plan or ideas, right, as to how to embed within that existing ecosystem.
If I may add to that,
Yeah,
Ali,
please. Yeah.
I mean, I think I appreciate, like, I think like the tact that you're taking with it, right? But I think like Chris, to build on what Ali is saying, I think, we would always take a step back, and to Ali's point, like who's doing this work on the ground, take a step back to say, what are some of the broader needs? Always see if and I think there's a decision to be made on some of these projects, right? Like whether it's a parks project, a housing project, a clean energy project. Is a developer or a city agency or state agency, does there need to be a nexus between that project and the community need? And if there does, how can we help them find that nexus? So to Ali's like excellent point, who's already doing this work well, that we can perhaps do some additional analysis and strategy work and then say, developer X, you know you're going to need to be hiring 30,000 people, and this organization is doing some really great XYZ training. There seems to be this kind of gap. We could help you put that together and structure it, and this could meet a need. And that $200,000 is going to close the gap. We're going to put you together and we're going to get out of the way, right? So there's that kind of targeted investment. And then sometimes it's, an organization will have money to invest broadly. There does not need to be nexus, right? A developer could be going in, it could be like an energy project, it could be a parks project. And what you'll hear from the community is like, what we really need is a mechanism to deliver meals to homebound seniors. And like, this is the thing that keeps everybody up at night, or while they're at work, they're worried about their parents. And so like, dear God, can someone fund this? And that actually has nothing to do with an offshore wind project. That has nothing to do with like the new park for kids that's going to have shade. But that is the one thing that is not getting funded and has gotten edited out of, in negotiations at the 11th hour, every legislative session. And so I think yes, like there are ways to think about how investments can be really targeted. Again, I think it depends on the community need, whether or not there are resources available on the ground. Because again, I mean, we're based in New York City, we work all over. Big cities tend to be very resource rich environments in terms of community organizations. City staff go someplace really rural. We did some work in very rural Massachusetts during COVID. We worked in some communities where there were like 4 towns sharing one part-time town administrator to think about all of their COVID support programs for businesses and individuals. Thinking about an investment of $200,000 there is a very different proposition. So again, trying to give you a very easy, direct answer for your very straightforward question, but I think it's always the truth
Wait.
is like, it's always more complicated.
No,
Yeah,
it
but I
is.
think you're hitting. Oh, Chris, please go ahead.
No. Go ahead, please,
I was
Ella.
going to say, I think you're hitting on something, Rebecca, that's really important, which is triangulating existing community need with an infrastructure, an energy, a development project coming in. And our general approach is to try to solve existing community need, like through some of this funding that you're talking about. And that means understanding who lives in a place. Where does poverty exist? Where is there underemployment? What are the skills that the people who live there already have? What are then either the jobs that we know are coming in, and to go back to workforce development, how do you leverage those people potentially already on the ground to bridge that gap? Or how do you stand up new programs and curricula, right, where that doesn't exist? Or where you, in a just more broadly real estate development project, where you can sort of help communities and economic development departments actually try to select or attract certain industries. How is that industry growing within that place already or that region? What do those in industries that are growing, what do those jobs pay? Are those family sustaining jobs? And actually trying to make economic development decisions, especially in regard to industry attraction, by starting with the baseline of who lives and works in places already, what do they need, and where can we fill those gaps?
Ali, you know what I think is also just, I think, so interesting, and like the approach that you're talking about, or that we try to uphold. And Chris, honestly, I don't want to say we get into hot water. I think anyone could get into hot water. I'd be so curious, like for folks who are tuning in, also like what your experience has been like with this. Sometimes we start down this road and like we'll do as much homework as we can ahead of time, right? But the truth is you're really only an expert in like the place in which you really very locally live and work, right? Like people will say to me, "Oh, you must be like be an expert at working in New York City." And I'm like, that's cool. Like from where I sit right now in this office, for me to get to like the South Shore of Staten Island is pretty far. For me to get to the furthest reaches of the Northwest Bronx, it's actually faster for me to get to Center City, Philadelphia. And so it's actually takes me as long to get to my parents' house in the Hudson Valley as it does for me to get to the Northwest Bronx, right? And so like where you have expertise and where you're local, where you have knowledge is very relative. And so sometimes like you could go in and do your homework and you meet with local organizations and community groups and local government and do your homework, and folks will say, actually, cool, we don't want this money. We don't want this project. These might be great high paying jobs, but it's only going to be for some people. It might be from people who are coming from away. We don't have enough housing. And so now, like, this new housing might get built. And then, wow, maybe the metro line or the bus line is going to get extended. And the last time that happened, we all got pushed out and displaced, and everything went up. And then there was a fancy grocery store. And then, like, we all had to move out again. And it had negative impact on us. So it's just, I don't know. I think there's this whole other thing going on we really have to think about, that I think in our quote professional world of thinking about sustainability or energy or infrastructure, like at face value, some of these projects can look great for the world, but it's also like great for who? And I don't know, just taking a step back. I've been thinking about it in the context of the Panama Canal lately, and really thinking about, like, they want to be building this whole new reservoir because of the drought, and we need to keep container ships moving. To do that, they want to physically relocate communities of people and put value on people's lives, right? Not saying that's the same thing with some development projects in the US, but it comes down to the same base question of, like, what are the impacts and externalities, and how do we think about it, and what gets surfaced, and how do we make decisions around it?
I absolutely agree with that. And just to answer part of what you asked me before, the first step in any of our more complex projects is doing a actual baseline analysis on social topics. A lot of the stuff is census based, essentially desktop review, but that can only go so far. And there's a lot of truth that lived experiences in these areas are not only the best screening method, which is a thing I hear a lot from people, but they also inform your choices if you're willing to listen. And that's where I think a lot of people drop off and just kind of stop listening to these conversations. And yeah, I think honestly, there's also value in just acknowledging the fact that there's a lot of lack of trust in a lot of these areas for broken promises over the years, or the fact that the public engagement model historically has been absolutely broken. The only time a lot of these people get to voice concerns in the area is 2 minutes during public hearings when it's tied to a permit. Thankfully, over the last couple of years, I think a lot of states and agencies have learned and trying to do better on that. But that's also come back in the fact that 50 years or so, that hasn't been the case. And it's going to take time to get past all of that. But also, actually, Rebecca, I want to change topics because you brought up another one that I've been pretty passionate about the last couple of years, actually, in regards to climate change impacts, and it's actually the need for more housing. And I've seen various numbers on this, but we're short m millions of houses in this country. And of course, a house could take any form, apartment, townhouse, condo, whatever. But that's not an issue or a problem that gets fixed overnight. So, what's the best way to go forward on this? And again, obviously, as I said, with the understanding that it's a long-term problem.
Um, well, I mean, maybe Ali and I are going to be co-appointees to run HUD in the next administration, and then we'll have the real answer to this problem that, I'm going to now attempt to answer in 90 seconds. Oh man, I mean, this is one I think, I don't want to say it's an intractable problem, because I actually don't think it is. I think there are times I'm going to say things and I'm like, okay, I share the name of the firm, and I'm going to say, like, as a team, we haven't necessarily talked about, is this a firm position or is this like Rebecca Karp's position? We give a lot of control to individual people and individual property owners and individual rights in the United States, which is very different than how other places and other societies make land use decisions. I think a lot about the time I spent in my youth living in Tokyo, and now living in my apartment in Brooklyn. I often say to my husband that I think we could fit 6 people comfortably in our essentially glorified studio apartment. Yeah, Ali, you say no, but like having lived in Tokyo and thinking about how we use space in Japan and like how my family in Japan lives, like we could totally do it comfortably. It would be great. Um, just decisions are made differently and government makes decisions differently. I don't think we're going to change how land use decisions are made overnight or maybe in my lifetime in the United States, Chris. But I do think there is an opportunity for business leaders and industry to be much more engaged and much stronger advocates for housing because it so directly impacts our ability like to deliver like our core function as businesses, like on behalf of the economy and for our workforce, right? And so as a business owner, I consider it to be my obligation to frankly agitate and advocate and lobby whenever I can for housing policy and regulation that benefits like my company and my team. The same way I think any organization that we advise, whether it be a developer who's building housing, whether it be an offshore wind organization who's going to be building a new project or a port, like we have that conversation with them, like Ali and I have been discussing here, where we're like, great, you're doing this. Cool. You want to think about a community engagement plan? Great. You want to fund swim lessons? That's excellent. But where are all these folks going to live? And like this job is going to pay $70,000 a year, and the average cost of a one-bedroom apartment is $5,000 a month, which means that this apartment is going to be $60,000 a year. And this job pays $70,000 a year before taxes. And like we literally have those conversations and then say, cool, so now we need to talk about investing in housing policy, housing research, potentially building housing. And then sometimes those conversations get very awkward and we get asked to stay in our lane. I've literally been told that before.
Wow.
So yeah, and I don't know, maybe I'm about to get some uncomfortable calls from clients or past clients, but here we are again, Achilles heel. So I think for me, I tend to approach it both through our professional practice and the work we take on, but then what's the power I have in the market as a business owner, and how can I encourage some of our clients who are business owners and other leaders, and then vote. If you're not registered yet to vote, like register. Employers, you're all legally obligated to offer paid hours off for your employees to vote. Make sure they know that. Everybody listening, you get paid. That time is paid when you go vote. So go vote and get a nice latte or whatever on your way back because you get paid those whole 2 hours. So just take all that time as you mosey back and like show off your sticker. And let's get people in office who are pro housing.
I'm just gonna hold this up. I don't know if you can see it. I happen to have my
Yes.
sticker right in front of me.
You did a great job. But Ali, you're working on a couple of housing projects that are like not just about new housing. Like I feel like you might have a different perspective on this.
Yeah, well, no,
What?
I agree with everything you said, and I appreciate sort of ending it on the voting piece because I think my initial thought is there's no silver bullet to solve this problem, but I don't see this changing without massive intervention from the federal government. Now, I'm Canadian, so I'm very comfortable with that. I know that's not the case here, but I really think the last time that we saw the level of housing production that's going to be needed in this case, right, was through the GI Bill, right, and post-war. And I just don't see a realistic way to do it without that. I also think to Rebecca's point about the way in which land is thought about in this country, to the extent that your property, that school districts are tied to your property values are tied to good school districts and the need, frankly, to just change zoning in places that could accommodate more density. I don't know how much is going to change without going back to that very core element of Americanness of like the centrality of your property to your prosperity, and that most people's wealth, right, is held on to via their home. So I think there's a myriad of changes that need to happen around that, and there are people a lot smarter than me who maybe have ideas there. To Rebecca's point, though, it's not just thinking about new housing. I'm working on and have worked on in the last year a couple of different projects where the answer is how do you think about the subsidies and incentives for preservation and rehabilitation. So I also think we need to have a conversation about the housing stock that exists, and in some cases, right sizing it for people who are aging in place, but have different needs now. And there's actually, a whole host of state and federal incentives and programs that do that. And it just feels like a really something that's not talked about as much, not to elide the complexity and the importance of, just building more units.
That's really
Ali, sorry, Chris, if I may, I just would add like one thing to what you're saying, Ali, like about kind of current housing policy in the US too, also being such that for those who are fortunate enough to own their housing, that's like a primary mechanism and driver of wealth, right? And wealth accumulation and how one will like maintain wealth throughout their life. I mean, we're also now entering an era where, kind of millennials and younger, right, are least likely to own homes than of any generation, like since like boomers, right? And so I think now too, as we're thinking about it, and to your question, Chris, and I think I don't know, Karp Strategies be a little bit broader definition of sustainability, right? Like we definitely think about energy and we think about the environment, but as we also think about sustainability of the economy and sustainability of the next generation to also, yeah, be able to live in cities where so many of us live now, right? Because that's where jobs are. It's also, yeah, what is next for housing? And like the sustainability of aging in the US, if home ownership is not a path. I don't know. Again, and maybe we're getting into some of the bigger questions that we don't necessarily need to be in this conversation, but this is where sometimes again you pull one thread and then this is some of the things that we're thinking about on a Friday afternoon over here.
no, and that's what I love about having these chats is everyone I've had thus far, I've ended up, well, a couple of things, feeling inspired to do various things, which I love, but also learning more about these topics I might not have known before. As both of you were talking, one question definitely came to mind. I've read a lot about the challenges in potentially repurposing structures that might currently be vacant to turn them into housing. And I think Ali, you mentioned this. Part of it is changing zoning, but then also it's just actual logistical engineering concerns and challenges to say hypothetically convert an office building into a condo or a townhouse or something. Is that a is that a viable option for any of this?
I I will give you my answer. There are people who are just working on this, and I actually hope to learn from, I think some of the first test cases are almost happening right now. I think there's one in Toronto that KPF is doing that's going to be hugely influential. They're also, I believe, repurposing, it's like AT&T or some other building in Midtown Manhattan. That's not the correct company, but it's pretty incredible economic shift, right? That this basically blue chip company has vacated their office building and now they're going to try to turn it into housing. So I honestly think in this case, Chris, that the proof is going to be in the pudding over the next like 2 to 5 years. My understanding that yes, it's a zoning change, but it's likely one that's more feasible to make, but that it's about going back to the very heart of actually where the zoning code came from about light and air, the number of bathrooms that you need, the number of wet walls that you need, that it's a very practical concern around like the different provisions that need to be in place for a residence versus an office. There's one other thing I was going to say, but I don't remember right now.
Yeah, and I'll give a shout out to Annie White, who's our director of real estate and economic development on our team, and like as a veteran of city planning, and has spent a lot of time looking at these types of conversions. And I think regardless of where you live in the United States, like the smallest town to the biggest city, like this will be like a relevant example. So just like think about if you walked into the middle of a really big grocery store, like a Kroger or like a ShopRite, or even like a Walmart, right? And you picture if that is like for like ground floor, or now picture if it's on like the 20th floor, the 10th floor. When you walk into the very middle and like look around, if you're in the middle of an aisle, you see no direct sunlight. And so picture if you were in the middle of that floor, no matter where, again, no, it doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter if you are in Nebraska or you are in Oregon or Florida or wherever, right? And you were like, huh, I have, I don't know, okay, please don't judge me here, people. Like I said, I'm not a designer. I came from the economic side. This is like 150,000 square feet. And you're like, wow, this could be split up into all of these different small families, right? Like for senior citizens, or it could be for couples or small families. You're like 150,000 square feet. I don't know, in New York, I'm like, that could be like 100 units or whatever, Elsewhere, you might be like, oh, that's 10 houses. But what about all those ones in the middle? So there's no sunlight. There's no emergency access to get in and out, right? So how would an ambulance get in? Right? Like to Allie's point about bathrooms, and then you picture it stacked. So like if you ever then say you're from Nebraska, but you've been to New York City and you've been to Macy's because you went to get your picture taken with Santa Claus. Now picture you're like going all the way up in the middle. And so you're thinking about if they ever like converted that kind of building, like just to get in and out alone for like emergencies and for daylight. And then on the sustainability side, thinking about how do you recycle all of that material? What does it look like? The building process. You then start to run into these questions of, does conversion make sense, or should you demo and build anew? And I think, yeah, to Ali's point, that's the heart of where we are right now. What makes sense?
And that it's often more cost prohibitive to reno in this particular case than it is to simply demo it and do it again. It's the Pfizer building, by the way, in Midtown.
Yes.
Yeah. And I also think about the surrounding infrastructure. Do you need a different kind of like sewer infrastructure and everything else around it to accommodate people who are living there as opposed to working there?
Yeah, like wastewater, yeah, or just
Yeah.
yeah, or like drinking like potable water in a
Yeah.
different way, and
No,
parks and yeah,
it's one of these things that
schools.
seems really simple. We have these vacant office buildings. Let's use them for a need that we clearly have. And yet my understanding of the infrastructural, financial, and architectural constraints are just, people are working on it right now. And it's going to be really interesting to see what lessons are learned from some of these first big conversions.
And
Chris, we're happy to come back next year, like, August
season two, there you
2025.
go. There you go. I like that. But I'm going to challenge you both on something. We
Okay.
talked earlier on for various reasons. There's definitely projected migration to the larger cities, and going to be for an extended period of time for various reasons. If we can't convert existing structures and there's only a finite amount of space in these locations, and cities are also projected to have some of the highest climate change impacts, whether it's heat, flooding, inland flooding, I could go on. How does that all jive? And potentially, to ask this another way, are big cities accounting for these types of challenges?
Boy, okay. So, you know how we started this on a really positive note, and you were like, I love that you're talking about, like students and like this is like great. We're starting on this note because of how hard climate change can be. Okay, I'm of two schools of thought on this. One is, Chris, like there are things about that are not gonna be great. I think people are gonna die. Like I think right now we have situations where in many cities, and it's not just in the US, this is around the world, right? Around the world, people are migrating to bigger cities for opportunities for work. Um, and people are living in conditions that are not healthy or sustainable, right? Basement apartments, overcrowding, sleeping in shifts, right? Like multiple people to a room in bunk beds, sleeping in shifts for shift works, at factories, things of that nature. It's not sustainable. We've had situations where there have been extreme flooding in some cities. People in basement apartments have not been able to be vacated in time, right? Or places where there are not air conditionings, in all housing, for example, in some cities, and we're seeing more and more extended periods of extreme heat, right? Which I think has been a topic of deep focus across the United States this year. So I think there are going to be negative impacts. I think that, and I think people will get sick, and I think some people will die. And I think that's really scary. I think on a different side of the die that you could roll there, because I don't think there's only two sides of the coin. I think there's like multiple sides of the dice we're going to roll. I think that there's like increased attention and awareness to how serious this is like the economic imperative around it, the human and moral imperative around it, the social and environmental justice imperative around it. And we see leaders all over the country, not just from community-based organizations who have been long championing this, right? Particularly in communities of color, particularly women of color who have been leading this charge everywhere. And we're seeing it more and more in private companies. We're seeing it more and more in government. We see cities like in New York, where now we have explicit city departments working on these issues, and not just from like engineering interventions, but real policy program financial interventions in ways that did not exist 5, 10, 20, 50 years ago. So as terrifying as some of it is, I also think there's reason to be hopeful. And again, I would say everybody needs to get to the polls so that we can ensure that the funding stays there for the work to be happening.
Just checking if you have any thoughts on that also, Ellie.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I agree with all that. I just wanted to add one more thing. I think when we talk about big cities, I also think it's just important to keep cities in mind and diversifying economies in different places. I won't get into specifics at this point, but there's, New York State is doing a lot to think about how to reinvest in places like Syracuse and Buffalo. How do you make those places, former Rust Belt towns, economically productive again, so that everybody isn't just flooding to New York City? If you were able to diversify and revive those economies through really intentional industry and sector attraction, private investment, public funds, creating jobs in new places where housing is more feasible, right, and cheaper to build. Like, I think it takes sort of the more networked approach to a solution. But also shout out to New York City, because I think we've been thinking about climate change for a really long time. So Chris, honestly, to your original question, yes, people are paying attention. The solution is not fun or easy or without a ton of red tape.
And just to tell a quick story, actually, Land NYC, the first issue of it was actually one of the things that helped really inspire me to go down this line of work. So I guess I have Bloomberg to thank for that one. I'm gonna go to the last question now before we wrap up on the happy, positive stuff. Do you think that potentially advances in domestic supply chain might be enough to anchor parts of the population in suburbs? And I know that I'm just tossing this one out there, but
Yeah,
just
no, it's okay. Just can you say, yeah, what's the classic thing you're supposed to say when your kids like start to say something at dinner and you're like, tell me more, right? Or like say more about that friend. So Chris, when you say like domestic supply chain, like what's triggering the question for you so we can dig into it a little more.
yeah, sure. I actually used an example I used on a podcast I taped last week or week before. Hypothetically, if the federal government wanted to build 10 transformer manufacturing plants in the suburbs of Ohio or Pennsylvania or wherever the case might be, hypothetically, are choices like that enough to keep part of the population there instead of migrating to the cities? So go after jobs.
Sure. I think, but I mean, I'm always going to say short and, right. If you've learned anything about me by now, I would say yes. And I think we always have to take a step back and again say, what's the physical infrastructure there, right? I think immediately when I think about like Ohio or Pennsylvania, I'm like, there's a baseline manufacturing infrastructure there. Like historically from industries that have been there in the past, there's like a historical workforce development culture of these things. There are educational institutions and training providers that have historically prepared people for those jobs. But I think I would say the same thing what we said previously when thinking about workforce development and like economic development, as Ali and I were describing, which would be to say, like what kind of materials, what kind of, economic development and jobs are we talking about? Who lives there now? What are the skills that are needed? And then like, how do we look at that workforce pipeline? And how do we think about this? I think to Ali's just the point Ali most recently made about like diversification of economies. How do we think about this as part of like a regional strategy for that part of the country? If we're thinking about, Ohio, Pennsylvania, that area, how do we think about that as a regional strategy for them to really diversify and grow and succeed? What are the other sub industries that we could build up around them to really help them shine and grow? And then how do we look ahead and do some future proofing? So whatever, supply chain they're then rolling up into to be supporting whatever macro level industry, if there are shocks in that industry, like how can we help protect that region? Those are some of the things I would think about. If some of those factories could be, outside of major cities, so folks can live in the suburbs, like fantastic. But I think it all comes back to fundamentally, do people have access to training? Do they have access to housing? Are there access to schools? Are there access to things we talked about before, like grocery stores, healthcare, transit, the basics?
Well, and exactly into that transportation point, are we building, I don't know, something in the green supply chain that is supposed to help climate and yeah, climate and sustainability, and yet building in a place that people are going to have to drive to, right? Like without a public transportation system. So I also think about how do you locate things in a way where you can sustainably move people around.
I think that's a great answer, both of you. We're starting to come up on time a little bit, so I'm gonna ask a version of the final question I was asked. And actually, Rebecca touched on the words of advice to undergrads and students before, but can you guys recommend any potential resources for people to learn more on these topics? And maybe do you have any final thoughts for people who might have a hard time finding the thing to be hopeful about on these potentially extremely heavy topics?
Yeah. So I'm going to separate those out. So recommended resources, new friends and colleagues, like we are always here for you. And whenever we have ideas and we have more than 10 minutes to write them down, like we share them on our LinkedIn page. And I'm not saying this in a self-promotional way. I'm saying this in like, we put ideas out there and we love when people send ideas back to us. So like coming out of this, I'm sure Ali and I are going to have a ton of ideas. And when we're both back from vacation, we're going to put them down and like share some stuff on LinkedIn. So let us know what you think. I think if you are like looking for a job in this kind of industry, I would definitely check out WOCS. It's WOCS, the Women of Color and Sustainability page on LinkedIn. Awesome collection of jobs. They post all of what the salaries are for every job. Great description. Excellent resource. If you're interested in thinking about, I know earlier we were talking a little bit about like being women in business and like starting an organization, what that's like. There's a woman, Alexandra Carter, who leads the program on negotiation at the UN and has done a lot in some of the big sustainability projects. She's someone that I would recommend you follow on social media or some of her trainings. I think on any of these topics, if you're another small business, particularly if you're a minority and women-owned business, there's a national organization called Interrise, interrise.org. They provide incredible free capacity building training to help you up your skills and get more contracts. And especially if you want to get involved in some of these big sustainability projects, they could be a great resource. And I think for like housing, real estate, et cetera, there are so many resources. One that I really like is IEDC, the International Economic Development Council. They have a ton of free resources online. If you become a member, there's access to more stuff, but they have things from like the most rural part of the country to like the biggest city, and lots of information about economic development, sustainability, community development, supply chain, workforce trainings. Like they have free webinars and podcasts, and it's just also a really nice community. And you could reach out to them anytime. So those are some places I might start. Ali, what do you think for resources on some of the things that you've been talking about?
Yeah, so for anything related to real estate, economic development. They do a lot on sustainability as well. ULI, the Urban Land Institute. There is really no, I've truly never been a part of an organization that is as like comprehensive, where the members are as dedicated. And those have, national, international, and local chapters. For anyone listening in New York City, I'd say the Urban Design Forum, who also thinks really holistically about urban issues, let's say writ large. For wherever you are in New York City, they're called community boards. I think there's no substitute for actually getting involved in your local community with whatever sort of form of like, hyperlocal government exists, and like seeing how these issues actually get solved or don't get solved, frankly, right? There's no better learning than seeing something that's gone awry and figuring out how you might do it differently the next time around. For negotiation, I would recommend having children. Negotiating with my 3.5-year-old
That's
and
all.
even my 1-year-old is amongst the most challenging. I'm not saying I'm successful, but it's amongst the most challenging things I experience every day.
I gotta thank you for that. I actually was not expecting that one. And it actually reminds me back to an episode I had about 2 months ago where it literally took me 38 minutes to get my 7-year-old to put on a pair of pants. So yeah.
Honestly, that's not that long in kids. So that's congratulations to you, Chris. You won that one.
So for our younger listeners out there who are contemplating their future, maybe babysitting would be a place to start if you really want to be honing your negotiation skills and you're thinking about future skill development. In terms of like your second question, Chris, how do you stay hopeful in terms of like these big, heavy, hard things? It can be hard sometimes, right? For me personally, there's a couple of things. One, I don't know, I think I'm like fundamentally wired to be someone who is always taking action. And I think part of that is being like the founder's founder. Like I'm like, this is a challenge. Like, let me think about a way of how I can help be part of the solution. Or if it's not my place because other people are working on this and that's not my role, then like, how can I amplify their work or help get resources to what they're doing? So that's part of how I'm wired. Um, Second, realizing that like there are some things I can change, there are some things that I can't change. And like finding my own way to be at peace with that, which is like a lifelong practice. Like I meditate and do breathing exercises every day, both for my health, but also because this work is really hard. And I have found that finding that headspace for myself so that I can do this work, especially in partnership with others, especially in these really complex projects, it's really important. You have to be like okay with yourself to be able to do this kind of work. I think then once you feel okay with that, being in community, there's no way I could do this by myself ever. And I think that's why I built the team and that's why we have a company. And this is why we work with other people on projects. And that's why we participate in podcasts. And like, that's to Ali's point, why you join a community board is like, I think change comes from working in community with others toward a shared goal. And there's so much power in that. There's so much power. And so I think just knowing what your why is and being true to the why and finding other folks who believe in the why with you and working toward it, for me, that's what it is. And for me, it's not always about work. Sometimes it's about things outside of work. Like my job is not who I am as a person, it's part of it, but like some of my why and how I approach climate change or economic development for me, it's outside of work as well. And so finding those other outlets is a big deal. I also try to laugh every day. And sometimes that can feel hard. I'm like, oh, it's 110 degrees. Like I might pass out on the way home, but okay, I'm just going to stop and like laugh in this bodega about how ridiculous this is because there's no other way to get through it. That's like my best practical advice. What
Fantastic.
do you think,
Ali?
Ali?
I think I'm heartened by surrounding myself with people who are maybe actually more positive about this than I am, who I think have a fundamental belief in human ingenuity. I think that, to Rebecca's point earlier, and not to try to get negative, but I think something, you know, more acutely catastrophic may need to happen for people to take very real action, but to believe in the power of human ingenuity, and that people, and honestly, I take solace in the fact that like people are working on this. People are paying more attention to it than they were a couple of years ago. But we have a present bias, and when something, I think as this becomes more present, it becomes scarier, and I become more optimistic that people will focus on it. But I feel I'm excited to be working in a field that is making a difference for my daughters and for everybody.
That I think is
Oh,
a great spot to end on. Yes,
I mean, Chris, I'm sorry. I was just gonna say though, like, here's the sales pitch. Like, not to like, and this is not toxic positivity. This is like, in the beginning, we were like, we know we have college students and grad students who are tuning in. And I said, maybe there are other folks at different ends of their career. How are they going to get involved? Like, getting involved. So not just volunteering, but like, get it. If this is something that you're like, this also keeps you up at night, like, get a job in the industry. If you're in college, get an internship. Karp Strategies hires interns. Chris hires interns. Every single person who's been on Chris's podcasts hires interns, like, or, people for full-time jobs, right? And like the best way to get involved is either, volunteering as you need to, or just rolling up your sleeves. And especially when you're early in your career, it really doesn't matter like what your title is or what the exact content is. Find someone who believes in you, roll up your sleeves, think about what some of those hard skills are going to be doing, and just like dive in, because none of us works in place for 20 years anymore. You're going to be stacking those skills and stacking those experiences. And so that's a little bit of my sales pitch, is also in the face of things that are really hard, like you have the opportunity to dig in. And so early, middle, later in your career, like, I don't know, we're here to support each other through it, I think, is part of what I've been realizing and thinking about as we've been having this conversation.
absolutely agree with that. And I've told this story a few times before on the podcast, and I think I'll wrap up with this again here. I was lucky enough to learn the industry from an expert at the time who'd been doing it even back then for 45 years, and was the first person to ever put emission controls on coal power plants in Michigan. At the time, what he was doing was the best available technology. I'm privileged now that I feel I'm making conscious choices to challenge what is best available practice and technology and do legacy work. And I would love down the line to hopefully bring on an intern or bring on a young employee to hopefully inspire and keep that chain going, because I think all that is extremely, extremely possible and powerful. But on that, I will thank you both for the incredible hour or so. I was not disappointed at all with the wrong word. I knew going in I would learn a lot, and I would love this hour and the conversation we had. I absolutely did. So thank you both very, very much for your time. And to answer your question, Rebecca, you will, and Ali, I'm sorry, will definitely be invited back next year. But on that note, I also have an announcement. I am lucky enough to have podcasts scheduled out through the end of 2024. And as they both alluded to on the call, but it's also important to make time for families. So I'm going to be pausing around the holidays and starting up again in January. So you guys have all of that to look forward to. And as always, follow on us on all the major podcast platforms. I think we're on like 18 or something by this point, which is insane. But thank you very much and have a nice day, everybody.